Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this edition of the We Are podcast. We are live from Ohio Stadium, the Horseshoe, where Penn State suffered a defeat at the hands of the Ohio State Buckeyes. But let's be real here. They came in, competed, and really put on a good show defensively against the Buckeyes on Saturday night in Columbus.
Hey, you know what, Jarrod? I just want to be entertained by games. I want to see good competition. When I watch sports are supposed to be entertainment, all right? We get caught up in our teams and expectations and goals. But at the end of the day, sports are an escape. You want to see good games. You want to see competitive games. I will be honest, and I think all of you need to be honest with yourselves. You probably thought Penn State was going to come in here and get their asses kicked. It was an 18.5-point line. Even some of the most diehard Penn State fans that I know thought that they were going to come in here and get crushed. They were down 27-24 going into the fourth quarter. So these kinds of games are always interesting to me. And by the way, as Jarrod mentioned, we're here at the Horseshoe. It's late Saturday night. This is my favorite venue to come to in the Big Ten. This is a great place if there's any Penn State fan that's never been here. But if you're here, watch the game on TV, this was a good game. And Penn State lost, and this was the third straight loss, and this was the number 4 team in the country a month ago, and this season has kind of fallen apart. And you can be angry about all of that. Whatever your goals were at number 4, fans can be pissy about that. But the reality is this team showed a heck of a lot today compared to last week against Illinois, and there is a lot of positive in that.
People talk about James Franklin as a coach, as a leader all the time. This was the perfect week for him to lose that locker room, and they came out and they competed.
Yeah, right.
And when that team showed that amount of character today, they went down the field, scored, and went up 7-0 against Ohio State. This week, with the slip-ups that he had, the loss against Illinois where they just got out-physicaled. Well, Penn State came out, and up front, I thought they pretty much dictated the pace of the game. They took really the run game out for about 3 quarters, and it really just didn't work out in the end because Ohio State's running back ended up being just breaking off a couple runs. And really, Penn State got themselves into a lot of conflicts with stupid penalties. Joey Porter Jr. had a couple. But this was the perfect opportunity for Penn State to lay down, surrender Cobra, and they didn't. And I think that speaks volumes to the way these guys respect James Franklin because, listen, you as much as you would love to put yourself in a vacuum and eliminate all talks and all distractions, that's physically not possible the way things are right now. So you're hearing your head coach, James Franklin, is linked to LSU. He just got a new agent, whether that's relevant or not. USC, he goes out, slips up at a couple of his pressers this week, mentions Ohio Stadium as the big house. It's the Horseshoe. Everybody knows that. Mentions Illinois, mentions Ohio State. But at the end of the day, they came out, they competed, and I think it's fair to feel a lot better after this loss, even though it's the third in a row, than you could feel about Illinois' loss.
I think that's a really good point about the leadership, and quite frankly, that's what I expected to see them come out. I've covered Penn State a long time. There has always been pride and character in this football team and this football program, and there are good leaders. And the way they got embarrassed by Illinois, I actually fully expected a nice bounce-back performance in this game. Now, I did not expect them to win. I picked Ohio State to win by 16, but I kind of felt in the back of my mind that they would be in the game for most of the night. I didn't think they would be this closely in the game, but we've seen it time and time again. They were 20-point underdogs in 2016, and they won that game. They've been double-digit underdogs in previous meetings against Ohio State, and they've competed. Why is that? Well, because Penn State has good players.
Yeah.
Penn State Penn State and Michigan, when they play Ohio State, they're going to have just about every bit as good of athletes and physical guys as Ohio State. When Ohio State plays everybody else in the league, they go out there with a massive advantage because they're just better than everybody else. They're not really that much better than Penn State or Michigan or some of these powerhouse teams. So I fully expected them to bounce back with a good showing. And I think you do make a good point, Jarrod, about James Franklin's leadership. He had these guys ready to play. Clearly he was distracted during the week. But that is why, even though it's a loss, even though all the goals are really gone now, there was a lot to like in the way Penn State played tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing, too, is, you still have that bowl game. You still have that extra opportunity to get more reps because, we don't know what Penn State's going to look like next year, whether it's going to be James Franklin, whether Sean Clifford's going to come back. But they have one more win to get to bowl eligibility. If you're able to get that, you have that extended period in December, I think, which is a great thing for development moving forward. But, you can say what you want about Franklin's game day management, and we can talk about some of the decisions that he made here in the second segment. But he had the team ready to play on a week that, they could have easily just wilted. And I think that speaks volumes to the type of character that this team has. Now, on the other side, this is probably about as equal as Penn State and Ohio State have looked on the field together. I don't think that Penn State was overmatched very often. I thought that the quarterbacks played rather well. C.J. Stroud had a couple bad passes. Sean Clifford was crippled by the fumble and then an interception.
Let me ask you this. I think this is an interesting point. They lost by 9, 33-24. Okay? If they played again, do you think Penn State is this close to this team in another game? Because I don't. I thought Ohio State really, really shot itself in the foot a lot tonight. And yes, you mentioned Joey Porter and Penn State had some issues, but Ohio State was not sharp.
The false starts were awful.
Yeah, I think
there's snap infractions too. I'm sorry.
Again, folks, we're trying to be honest here and give you the pros and the cons. The cons is they've lost 3 in a row. The pros is they lost by 9 points on the road to the number 5 team in the country. Having said all that, though, if they played again, I think Ohio State is significantly better than Penn State, and I can see why people would think that they would beat them by 14, 17, 20 points. They didn't tonight. And that is a good sign for Penn State. But at the same time, if I'm Ryan Day, I'm not happy with how my team played tonight.
No, absolutely not. I think, listen, we talked to Penn State when they were at Iowa how many false start penalties that they got. Well, if you're the home team and you're getting this type of false start penalties and these snap infractions, that's inexcusable.
Yeah, right.
You're the number 5 team in the country. But at the same time, on the field between the trenches, I thought Penn State played their best game up front.
Yep.
Now, defensively, yes. Offensively, not so much. And we'll get to that here in the second segment on the We Are Podcast and the DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcasting Network. Welcome back to the We Are Podcast, the DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcasting Network, live from Columbus, Ohio. Cory, what do we know about Penn State right now? We are now 5-3. We're 8 games into the season. What do we know?
That if Sean Clifford is healthy, this Penn State team has a chance. Okay, they were going to beat Iowa, period. End of discussion. They looked terrible against Illinois because he wasn't close. When he is healthy, he is a good quarterback. He threw a bunch of passes today. He threw for a bunch of yards. He gives them a chance. Okay, but they can't run the ball for crap, man. I mean, this is the most one-dimensional Penn State team I think I've ever seen. Maybe, and I have to go back with people that have watched them for decades. This is a one. Think about this. I focused heavily on this, Jarrod, last week. Illinois beat Penn State with 38 yards passing, which you would think that would be almost impossible to run for 357 and be so terrible that you throw for 38 yards and you still win the game.
Don't forget, it only took 9 overtimes.
That's right. Penn State almost came in and beat Ohio State with 40 yards rushing. Mm-hmm. Think about that. Think about if this team were balanced at all, for goodness sake. They maybe do win this game. But Sean Clifford has to do basically everything on this offense.
Yeah, and I think the alarming thing is when we talk about the running back room coming into the season, I think that was one of the strong suits, right? That was one of the things that we thought, they were deep. They have Noah Kane. He's coming back. They have Kevon Lee coming back. Devin Ford didn't see any action tonight. John Lovett, they have him coming in from Baylor. He's been pretty solid. Do you think the issues are with the running backs themselves or up front? Because up front, the left side of the Penn State line today did not do a great job of protecting Sean Clifford.
This offensive line for Penn State is absolutely horrendous in run blocking. This is not the running backs. Now, no, Kane fumbled the ball. You can't do that. They have nowhere to go. I think Audrey Snyder from The Athletic had a stat, a huge number of carries this season. Guys met at the line of scrimmage or in the backfield. You can't run the ball when you have nowhere to go.
And that's been a thing since Saquon played here.
Saquon
and he was hitting the backfield more often than not. But Saquon Barkley was an all elite athlete, right? He's an NFL star when he's healthy.
Didn't average 100 yards a game as a senior, though, or his last year. He didn't average 100 yards a game. He was held under 100 yards in 8 of 13 games.
You have an injured quarterback who's now close to 100% or at 100%. Your goal is to keep him upright. And they at times did, but at times they didn't, and it looked absolutely horrendous.
Jarrod, it was 27-24 midway through the fourth quarter, and Penn State finished with 33 yards rushing. What does that tell you about if this were even remotely close to a balanced offense? So what's the problem? Okay, when we ask, what do we know about this Penn State team? We'll get to defense in a minute too. The Mike Yurcich offense, I'm not smart enough to know what offensive linemen do and are taught technique-wise in a passing game versus look, folks, I don't know. I didn't play the offensive line. But when you bring a guy in that's hoping to turn your offense into a 40-point offense, and you are just incompetent running the football, that's a system thing. These are not terrible offensive linemen.
No.
Rasheed Walker and Caden Wallace will play in the NFL for a long time. Now, people could say, well, they haven't played great and they've hurt their – whatever. They're going to play in the NFL for a long time. I don't know if anybody else will on this line, but, man, when you rush for 33 yards and you can't run the ball even against Villanova – it is just you go into every game with Sean Clifford having to do everything.
We mentioned that this is Sean Clifford's 75th offensive coordinator in about 5 years. It's the same thing for the offensive lineman.
Yeah, right.
So that's and I know you go from Matt Limegrover to Phil Troutwine, and I don't think this is necessarily on either of those two. Right, I think this is a schematic thing.
It's got to be,
and because these guys are good athletes, they're good offensive linemen. They come in highly touted. They've recruited the position well of late, but schematically they got to figure out a way to make this work. And now Mike Yurcich has never been strong in the run game, and we mentioned in our predictions. I thought that the Penn State run game would make James Franklin. He said this earlier this week. He would love to get a beer with all the beat writers, whatever. Well, and I mentioned in my prediction that this game would make him want to drink an entire case of beer, and it would.
That was a good comment. I'll give you seriously, as we're doing this, I'm giving Jarrod a pat on the back because that was a great comment.
It feels absolutely phenomenal. Cory's been pumping my ego all night, But the thing is, you have to be able to run the football in the Big Ten. You have to be able to run the football if you want to compete nationally. You want to get to that elite level that James Franklin talked about. You have to run the damn football.
So what do we know about Penn State?
We know that they can't run the damn football.
We know that basically they've got a nice passing game when Clifford is healthy, but we know that this is a very incomplete offense. The defense looked completely terrible against Illinois, but they come back tonight and they have a nice effort. Travion Henderson had 22 yards on 15 carries before he broke off the 68-yard run. So what that tells you, and then they had another big run later on. What that tells you is when the defense just has so much on its plate and so much pressure because your offense is still struggling, you can look great on 95% of your defensive plays. You're going to break every now and then.
Right, and the offense, this is probably the best complimentary football that they've played in a while. Though the fumble, the scoop and score that Ohio State had, I thought was the dagger. That put 7 points on the board for the Penn State for Ohio State, and their offense doesn't even step on the field. You can't defend that, right? And what we know about Penn State, their defense came to play today. They held Ohio State to 26 points. You take that I don't consider that a defensive issue. I think that because the defense wasn't on the field. So I think they gave up 26 points to an Ohio State offense. It's pretty elite. It's a very good offense.
Yeah,
up front,
sensational.
And
offense.
We mentioned we talk about being focused and really buying in. And I think I was speaking with Arnold Ebiketie after the game, and he was like, when we're focused and our attention to detail is there, that's the type of game we can play. So I think back to that Illinois game, because I think the Illinois game this year is the game that you think back to and you're like, what the F? What happened? It was a severe lack of attention to detail, lack of execution, a lack of everything.
Well, but James has focused on that. I think they had a lot of injuries.
Right.
He even talked about it in his postgame. I don't think we know what the deal with this team was going into that Illinois game. He didn't even want to get into it tonight.
Yeah, the Iowa game broke both teams.
It really did. But I think Penn State, he talked. Look, folks, it's not an excuse. It's a reason. If guys are hurt and they can't practice, that impacts you. And people can say that's an excuse, but James was pretty, straightforward about tonight. That maybe we can talk about what happened against Illinois at some point. I think that they went into Illinois way, way more banged up than any of us could possibly know.
Right, and at Penn State, they're not going to give us those details.
Yeah.
And whatever. You can say what you want about that until you're blue in the face. But you're right. I think they were banged up. I don't think their attention to detail was where it should have been, because it couldn't be. Right? And when you have that, but again, we're talking about what do we know about them. We know the defense is good. We know that that the offense can throw the ball. Parker Washington had an incredible game against the Ohio State Buckeyes. Keandre Lambert-Smith was clutch. Brenton Strange did some good things. And Jahan Dotson's, of course, Jahan Dotson. Right? And listen, anytime that you have Clifford on the field, and this is a polar opposite of what Clifford was last year, anytime Sean Clifford's on this field and performing and he's healthy, they have a chance to win the game.
He's your only chance.
Right.
Last year, Sean Clifford was losing games. This year, the only way they can win is if Sean Clifford does everything.
Right. And I think it speaks volumes of how they feel about Tyquan Roberson, because he didn't play last week and Sean Clifford was not anywhere close to 100%.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems with this Penn State team, but there are games left. The way they came in here and battled. Now, can they repeat this kind of full bore, 100% focused energy the rest of the game, the rest of the season against a Maryland, against a Rutgers? Certainly, you're going to have it against Michigan, but are you going to have it against Michigan State? You should. That's on the road. So, 7-5 is still on the table. 9-3 is on the table. Everything is on the table at this point because we just
5-7 is still on the table.
No. Hey, look, I would have thought that coming into this, the way they played against Illinois, the team that we saw tonight should not lose to Rutgers or Maryland.
Right.
No, they shouldn't. And there is some payback factor. Not that they like to get into the whole revenge game, but Maryland whipped them badly last year.
That was embarrassing.
It was a 27-point underdog, and they crushed them. And so I think there's some payback factor for this week. Then you got Michigan, and Michigan doesn't throw the ball great. So when I say that there are no goals left, again, 9-3 is still a possibility. 7-5 is a possibility. And we're going to talk about here in a few minutes how all of that will impact James Franklin, because we have a lot of questions not only about the rest of this season, but what will happen to this Penn State football program going forward. Mm-hmm. And to me, a big part of James Franklin's future, and then the huge domino effect, is these next 4 games.
Right.
You go 3-1, James Franklin is still – we'll get into that here in a few minutes.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because we mentioned this before, and we mentioned this on our YouTube video. How we felt about Penn State at Iowa. We know that Penn State lost at Iowa. It was based on injuries. Illinois came out and out-physicaled Penn State because Penn State couldn't play a physical brand of football. We thought the world was falling apart. The world was ending for Penn State football. They lose, blah, 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 blah. It's awful. Now, Penn State comes out, plays competent football, competitive football. Okay, well, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, because you're right. They could go 9-3. Michigan, I think you saw the blueprint to beat them. Obviously, that's for what Paul Bunyan's axe, right? The trophy. It's not nearly as prestigious as the Land Grant. Let's be real here. But all joking aside, because the Land Grant Trophy is hideous, and we're going to do a podcast just solely as ugly as that someday. But you see the blueprint to beat Michigan. Penn State and Maryland is, I think, a little bit worse than Penn State. I think Rutgers is the same. They should handle that. So there's 7.
So you got to beat either Michigan.
You got to get to bowl. You got to
right.
And now you get to be spoiler because Maryland's not Maryland, but Michigan State. Too many M's here. But Michigan State is going to be a top 5 football team, I think. They beat Michigan. The running back there,
Ohio State.
Kenneth Walker, had an incredible game.
Right. Michigan State, I'm looking to see when they've still got to play Ohio State before Penn State.
Yeah, there's a lot that can happen in the Big Ten, but Penn State now plays a key role in that.
How about this? The week before Penn State goes there, Michigan State goes to Ohio State.
Right.
So you could have basically a 10-0 Michigan State team and goes and loses at Ohio State. Then what will that do psychologically to Michigan State in that last game?
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you have things to play for, because right now, Michigan State's on the outside looking in. I think they, with their win over Michigan, I think they'll bump up a little bit. I'm not quite sure what the rest of the top 10 did tonight, or Saturday night, I should say. But Penn State has the opportunity to be the spoiler, and I think that's a great position because now they're going to be the underdog against Michigan. They're going to be an underdog against Michigan State.
Right.
They get to go in with that underdog mentality, that chip on their shoulder. Can they pull off those upsets? Can they spoil those seasons and be that type of team?
You're not wrong. All of that is true, and that is the reality of what they've got to play for. They were the friggin' number 4 team in the country a month ago, and now we're talking about Penn State to play a spoiler role. Is that what Penn State football is? I don't think that you would have any Penn State football fan out there that would say, when you're the number 4 team, and then 3 games later you're talking about playing spoiler, I'd be pissed. Seriously, I'd be pissed about that. Because, look, we're giving you the reality of the pros and the cons, and I'm trying to make a case here that Penn State fans can feel better about this. But if I can remove my journalist hat, and if this were my team, Jarrod, you've been a Penn State fan, right? Do you think it's right for Penn State fans to still, I mean, even if they're optimistic about how this game played out, to still say, what the hell, man? We were the number 4 team in the country a month ago.
Yeah, and they're honestly half a football away from being the number 2 team.
Yeah, sure. If
right?
Not hurt.
To
go from that to playing spoiler, hell, that's what Maryland does. That's what Northwestern does.
What is the ceiling of the Penn State football program? James Franklin mentions elite all the time, right? You want to be the elite. You don't become elite by competing with Ohio State.
Then let's take a break and we'll talk about that because that's a big discussion with regards to the future of James Franklin.
Right. And we'll catch you on the flip side here for this third segment, the We Are Podcast on the DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcasting Network. Welcome back to the third and final segment of the We Are Podcast and the DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcasting Network from Columbus, Ohio. We talked briefly about James Franklin's future. What is the ceiling of Penn State football, right? I mean, the James Franklin, we're the elite. We want to be the elite. Well, you can't get to being elite when you're competing against Ohio State. You have to beat them consistently, right? People talk about little brother, big brother in Michigan and the Mitten State. And Michigan State's had Michigan's number. Harbaugh, you want to talk about an elite program or lack thereof, he gets routinely beat by Ohio State and Michigan State. And when you're winning every other year against Penn State, what is your ceiling? What do you want your ceiling to be as a program? Clearly, the goal is to be top tier. And I think Alabama is there. Right now, they're not. They have that one loss, the bad loss to Texas A&M. They are the epitome of elite. Dabo and Clemson, they struggled against a Florida State team that's really turned it on after the embarrassing loss that they had earlier in the season. So what, Cory, is Penn State's ceiling? Because this is where it gets kind of tricky. What is their ceiling?
Penn State is a really good college football program that you think can get to 8 wins pretty much any year, 9 wins a lot of years, and 10 every now and then. It's not this is not an elite program, obviously. There are only a handful of those. Oklahoma and Georgia are in that discussion as well. Penn State is a top 12 to 15 college football program. And the other 120 college football programs in the country, well, yeah, another 100 would love to be in that range. Okay, but Penn State has issues, and clearly when you're in this division, when you have to play this team every year, it's a challenge. When we talk about James Franklin, and I now do believe he's going to USC. Let me ask you real quick. Do you think James Franklin is leaving after this year? Because you didn't 2 weeks ago.
Right. And I think it's much more. I think it's more 65-35 that he's leaving.
So you're 65% leaving.
I think 65-35 that he's staying.
You're 65-35 he's staying.
Yes.
I'm 65-35
I was much higher that he was staying.
Yeah, you were convinced a couple weeks
ago.
ago.
Yeah, and now I'm not so much. And the reason why is this week, right? We talked about this on Sports Central, on your radio show on WRTA FM in Altoona. And, you don't see the uncharacteristic slip-ups that he has. He is. We talked about this on the way here. He's kind of like a robot, right? He says the right things. He says nothing. He says stuff without saying anything. And that's like all the coaches, right? You talk about the Tomlinisms, right? Obviously, the standard is the standard. Whatever. Thank you guys for coming out. It is what it is. But he mentioned Illinois. He mentioned the Big House. You don't confuse the horseshoe and the Big House, no matter who you are. Now, I will say it with this. I think he was very much distracted by that game Saturday because that's a game that would give you nightmares. And he did not look the greatest physically on Saturday against Illinois. Yeah. And that game right there would give me nightmares, stomach ulcers, hemorrhoids, you name it, it would give me those issues. And I think it's fair to say that he was distracted. And listen, when you have, again, we talked about this in the first segment, you can't put yourself in this vacuum as much as you want. If you simply look at your phone, you're going to have texts from whoever, wherever. If they have your number, they're going to text you and say, hey, are you going? Are you staying? Whatever. You've got recruits. You've got families. You've got players. You've got coaches. Because let's not forget that James Franklin is responsible for a lot of the livelihoods of his coaching staff. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and that's why he wants to get a beer with us someday. Obviously, right, and right now it's a case of beer because that running game, a beer for every yard of rushing.
Well, I want to get back to why I think he's leaving, and that's this Ohio State game.
Yeah,
you got to battle this team every year. They're in your division. James Franklin wants to. The bottom line is, folks, if this offends Penn State fans, I'm not sorry. Ohio State is better than Penn State, and that's all there is to it. Ohio State is elite. Penn State is not. Ohio State is better than Penn State. Ohio State has better facilities than Penn State. Ohio State has a better football program than Penn State. Ohio State has more money than Penn State. Ohio State has better tradition than Penn State. There is nothing really remotely close about the two programs in terms of their history. And again, this may piss off Penn State fans who think that Penn State is at Ohio State's level. It's not. Because Ohio State is one of the 3 or 4 or 5 elite programs in this country, and Penn State is not, and has not been since the 80s. Mm-hmm. All right? And
I would say 90s, early 90s, the 90s.
Maybe, but since the Big Ten. Yes. 94.
Yeah, when they were independent, it was much better.
Correct.
But this Big Ten alignment is terrible.
This right here is, to me, the number one reason why I think he would want to leave Penn State. You got to beat this effing team to do anything. Yeah. At USC, you got to beat Oregon. At USC, and Oregon has had a lot of success the last 15 years, but they're not remotely close to Ohio State.
The Big Ten schedule, the Big Ten East is a gauntlet.
We're not even talking about Michigan and Michigan State. You've got to beat this team to even have a shot. Jarrod, what are Penn State's 4 best wins in this entire century? 05 against Ohio State, the Tamba Hali sack. 08 against Ohio State, the Mark Rubin strip sack. 16 against Ohio State, the kick 6, and then Wisconsin. Penn State's 4 best wins this century, 3 of them have been against Ohio. Why is that? Because if you beat them, you can achieve your goals.
Right.
And James Franklin knows that, and I think James Franklin, folks, again, if I'm pissing you off, I'm not sorry. Ohio State is better. And James Franklin knows that Ohio State has a better program than Penn State. And so why wouldn't he want to leave? If his goal is to win the national championship, USC probably offers a much more easier path than that.
And that's right. I mean, the Big Ten leaders in Legends conferences were much better. The alignment is terrible.
But you're still going to have Ohio State in your division.
You're going to have to beat Ohio State. The road to the Big Ten championship runs through Columbus, Ohio. And I don't mean that just because you actually have to drive physically through the city just to get to Indianapolis. But you have to beat Ohio State if you want to get there. It's just that way. James Franklin can beat Michigan. James Franklin and his Penn State teams can beat Michigan State.
He's 1-7 against Ohio State, and it took. I don't call it a fluke. I don't ever call the kick sticks a fluke. They were prepared. It was a great play, but they needed what I believe the greatest play in the history of Penn State football for James Franklin to beat Ohio State.
Gary's touchdown catches up there, but yes,
it is.
There
also the Giftopoulos against Miami. I'll debate that, but they needed an unbelievable miracle play to beat Ohio State once, Jarrod, in 8 tries.
That alone set the tone and really flipped the script with Penn State that decade. Really, because they were mired in the sanctions. They were a mediocre football team.
Turned the program around, but they haven't beaten them since.
Right.
But they've lost by one
to
twice.
be elite, you have to beat Ohio State.
So I want to
1-7 isn't going to cut it.
You're still 65-35. He stays?
Yes.
Why is that? Tell me why.
I don't know that many people are going to want him.
Okay.
If he finishes 7-5, but again, the grass isn't always greener, right? But at the same time here, we talk about Penn State and they lose against Ohio State every year. And then they have one loss that they shouldn't lose to.
Yeah.
They have that one bad loss every year. One year it was Pitt. This year it was Illinois. You know, you lose to Iowa, great. It's 3. They're the 3 ranked team in the country. You lose your starting quarterback. You can't lose to Illinois. You can't lose that bad game every year.
But see, I'm asking you why you think he stays. Why? Right. If he's 7-5 and USC doesn't have an offer, but let's say they go 8-4. Why do you think he's still here next year?
I mean, I think he's a Pennsylvania guy. I think honestly,
you're buying all that Pennsylvania boy with a Penn State heart.
I mean, listen. I think the comfort level is there, but I do think that hot seat is really starting to heat up. And here, yes, because
so
how fed up
you're going to get fired next year?
Maybe, I don't know.
So why wouldn't you strike while the iron's hot when you can go somewhere that wants you?
Well, do they want him?
Well, that's what's at stake. These next 4 games.
Right.
Okay. He's got to beat either Michigan or Michigan State. He's got to win one of those games.
Yes.
Because if you lose both of those games, the best you can do is 7-5. And if I'm USC, even if I loved the guy 2 weeks ago, if he goes 7-5, and at that point that would make us either 5-3.
They would be 11-10 over the last 2 years.
11-10, yeah, because 4-5, and that'd be 7. That's not good. And if you're USC, are you going to pay that guy $8-9 million? But that's whether USC wants him.
Right.
To me, the question is, what does James Franklin want? And I think James Franklin sees what is in front of him with Ohio State. And in his mind, if he wants to win a national title, he might tell you over drinking a beer that he thinks he can do it here, and maybe he can. But I think there's a significantly higher chance that he can do it somewhere else.
Right, and listen, it's not going to be easier at LSU. The easiest way to get to the college football playoff and get to the promised land is through the Pac-12.
Yeah, I've never thought LSU. I think Mel Tucker's going to LSU.
Yeah, and listen, we talked about this multiple times when we had lunch with Tom Reed today. Mel Tucker is a bad dude. He stared me through the eyes, through the camera lens today, and I started shaking.
He just looks mean mad all the time.
I had to check my pants.
But if he gets look, I think James wants USC. People I've talked to that have some familiarity with some inner work. They think James wants USC, and they think USC wants James. So the pressure on James Franklin is to not screw it up by going 7-5. And that's why they had better come out and beat Maryland. You lose to Maryland. Remember that leadership we talked about on the team earlier? You lose to Maryland this season, could fall apart.
Well,
they've had good
if
leadership.
they lose to Maryland and if it's even close against Rutgers, I think it's a very good chance Sandy Barber's in James Franklin office or vice versa, and you need to step your stuff up. You need to step it up, or we're going to go another way.
Well, I don't think he gets fired after this year.
No.
He does get an asterisk for last year for
Yes.
COVID. But he can look, folks, we've been talking about James Franklin to USC. If they crap the bed the rest of this season, we're talking about James Franklin going into next year on the hot seat at Penn State.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, right now, you can say what you want about this game. The Illinois game is going to be put up there on the clipboard, the bulletin board. You don't lose that game. Now, like I said, I still think that he stays. I think Penn State, honestly, if I'm James Franklin and I'm Sandy Barber, I'm at the Big Ten offices, and I'm sure it's the same other schools, except for the Big Ten West, because Big Ten West is like, we are fine. Wisconsin and Iowa. Wisconsin now, after their first game, they're going to be in the Big Ten championship.
It's interesting because I am going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're going to beat one of the Michigans and that they're going to beat Maryland and Rutgers. And to me, if they're 8-4, he has shown he can build a program. He built it at Vanderbilt. He built it at Penn State back up. That is what USC wants. USC is not in. See, Penn State, I don't think James Franklin can get Penn State to a national championship. But that's not what USC wants from James Franklin right now. USC would want James Franklin or any other coach to build them back into respectability.
The Trojans are a work in progress.
They are. They're 2 to 3 to 4 years from getting to where Penn State is now or has been. So James Franklin has shown he can do that. And so that, to me, is why I do think that they will remain interested in him as long as they can get to, say, 8 wins.
And that's again, and I think that's one of the things, too, where I think that he stays because he doesn't want that project. All right? So, but that's a story for a different day. This has been the We Are Podcast and the DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcast, DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcasting Network. Thank you, as always, for listening. We'll catch you again next week after the Penn State's game against Maryland.